What would you do if you found a treasure buried beneath the earth, a treasure that could change your life forever? Yet, the price of owning it could cost you everything you have. Join Eliab on a journey of sacrifice, faith, and the discovery of a treasure far greater than gold, in a story that reveals the hidden riches of the heart. Eliab's hands were calloused and sore as he wiped the sweat from his brow. The field stretched out endlessly before him, the dry earth cracked under the heat of the midday sun. A modest man with a quiet spirit, Eliab had lived in this small village for as long as he could remember. His father had plowed these same fields, and his father before him, the weight of their family's legacy pressing down on his shoulders with each passing day. His wife Miriam had often said that the soil had a way of getting into a man's bones, changing him without him even knowing it. And she was right. There was something in the earth that bound Eliab to this land. Yet every night when he lay beside Miriam in their small home, he dreamed of more. Not of riches but of peace, a life free from the constant toil. He dreamed of a future where his children could laugh without the weight of hunger in their eyes, where Miriam could rest instead of always worrying about the next meal. But those dreams felt like distant stars, far out of reach, as distant as the empty horizon that met his gaze. The sound of his plow cutting through the dirt was a reminder of his station, a man tied to the land, unable to break free. That evening, as Eliab made his way home, he took a different path through the village. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the fields. He walked past the familiar stone walls of the village and turned onto a path that led to a forgotten field, once owned by a family who had long since moved away. The field was overgrown, wild grasses and thorny bushes threatening to swallow the land whole. Yet there was something about it that called to Eliab. He had passed this field many times before, but tonight, as the light of the setting sun caught the glint of something buried beneath the earth, he couldn't ignore it. Curiosity stirred inside him. He knelt and began to dig, his hands shaking slightly with the excitement of discovery. At first, it felt like just another stone, but as he dug deeper, his fingers brushed against something solid, something metal. His heart raced as he cleared away the dirt to reveal a small, weathered chest, half buried in the ground. He sat back on his heels, his breath shallow as he stared at the chest. His mind swirled with disbelief. Could it be real? Could it be treasure? He opened the chest with trembling hands, and the sight that greeted him made his heart stop. Gold coins, jewels, and precious artifacts glittered in the soft light of the setting sun. He reached in, his fingers brushing against the cold, smooth surface of a gold coin, feeling the weight of it in his palm. For a moment, everything else in the world disappeared. He forgot about the heat of the day, the aches in his muscles, the endless toil that had defined his life. In his hands he held the promise of something greater, something more than he had ever dreamed. Eliab sat there in the fading light, the chest before him, filled with riches beyond his imagination. His first instinct was to seize the treasure, to claim it for himself. After all, he had worked hard all his life and no one would know where it had come from. His family had suffered enough, and this treasure could change everything. Miriam could have the life she deserved. His children could grow up without knowing hunger or want. But then a thought, deep and unsettling, began to form in his mind. This treasure wasn't his. It wasn't meant for him, not yet. He had no claim to it. The field did not belong to him. It was someone else's land, someone else's possession. The weight of the decision pressed on him, heavier than the chest of gold. He closed the chest and carefully covered it with dirt once again, marking the spot with a stone. He stood up, his mind a whirlwind of emotions, excitement, fear, guilt, and hope. As he walked back to the village, his steps slow and heavy, Eliab wondered if he was making the right choice. Could he really walk away from the treasure? Could he live without it, knowing that it was just within reach? Yet, deep down he knew that something more important than gold was at stake: honor, integrity, and the choice to live a life of truth. When Eliab arrived home, the sight of Miriam waiting for him by the fire brought a sense of calm. Her gentle eyes, the way she smiled as he entered filled him with a quiet gratitude. Despite all the hardships, she had always been his rock. Miriam was the one who saw beyond the toil, who believed in the dreams that often felt too distant for Eliab to touch. "Did you find anything?" she asked, her voice warm but laced with the concern of a woman who had seen the weariness in her husband's eyes for too long. Eliab paused before answering. He felt the weight of his decision in his chest. He wanted to tell her everything, to reveal the treasure he had found, but something held him back. "I found something," he said finally, his voice low. "Something that could change everything. But it's not ours, Miriam. It's not meant for us." Miriam tilted her head, a quiet understanding in her eyes. "What are you saying, Eliab? You found a way to make our life easier. We've struggled for so long." Eliab sat down beside her, his head in his hands. "I can't take it. I can't claim something that doesn't belong to me." Miriam took his hands in hers, squeezing them gently. "You always do what's right even when it's hard. But if this treasure could help us, if it could bring us peace, perhaps it is a gift meant for us after all." Eliab shook his head. "No. The right thing is to buy the field, to work for it honestly. If I want this treasure, I must earn it, not take it." Miriam looked at him for a long time as if weighing his words. Finally she spoke, her voice steady and resolute. "Then let us do what we must together. If we have to sell everything we have to buy that field, then we will. You've always known what's right, Eliab. Trust that." The following days were filled with turmoil and uncertainty. Eliab spoke to the landowner of the field, a gruff man who had little interest in parting with the land, let alone for the meager price Eliab could offer. Yet, something in Eliab's persistence wore down the man's resistance. Eliab and Miriam sold everything they owned, every goat, every tool, their modest home, even the blanket that had kept them warm on cold nights. It was all they had, but in their hearts they knew it was the only way. The day they handed over the final coin to the landowner was the most bittersweet moment of Eliab's life. He had sacrificed everything for something he could not yet touch, but the belief that the treasure was his only through honest means gave him a quiet satisfaction. As they stood on the edge of the field, the sun low in the sky, Miriam placed a hand on his shoulder. "We've done what we could, Eliab. Now we wait." Eliab wasted no time. With his bare hands he began to dig, each scoop of earth feeling like a weight lifted off his shoulders. He was no longer bound by fear or doubt. The treasure was there, waiting to be found, and he would claim it, honestly, with all the sacrifice he had made. As the chest finally emerged from the earth, shining in the pale light of dawn, Eliab's heart swelled with a joy he had never known. It was more than just the gold, it was the feeling of having done what was right, of having trusted in something greater than himself. He opened the chest, his fingers trembling. Inside, the treasures he had seen before sparkled with a beauty that took his breath away. But as he looked at the jewels, the gold coins, and the fine silks, his thoughts turned not to wealth but to the future he would create for his family. Eliab knew the treasure was more than just material wealth. It was the promise of a new life, of a future built on integrity, faith, and the love of his family. Jesus had been watching Eliab from a distance, his gaze warm and knowing. He had seen the struggle, the sacrifice, the quiet determination of the man who sought the treasure with all his heart. As Eliab stood there in the field, surrounded by the fruits of his labor, Jesus approached, his presence gentle but commanding. "Eliab," he called, his voice carrying through the stillness of the field. Eliab turned, startled, but his face softened when he saw the rabbi standing before him. "Lord," Eliab said, his voice full of awe. "How did you?" Jesus smiled, the light of understanding shining in his eyes. "I have watched you, Eliab. I have seen your heart, your sacrifice, your faith. You have found the treasure, but more importantly, you have found something far greater, the kingdom of heaven." Eliab's brow furrowed in confusion. "The kingdom of heaven, Lord? But this treasure?" Jesus nodded, his eyes full of compassion. "This treasure is like the kingdom of heaven. It is hidden, waiting for those who seek it with all their heart. You have given up everything to possess it, and in doing so, you have found a peace and joy that surpasses any earthly wealth. Eliab knelt, overwhelmed by the truth of Jesus' words. Lord, I have spent my life seeking something better. I thought it was treasure, but now I see it is you. Jesus placed a hand on his shoulder. Yes, Eliab. It is not what you possess, but what possesses you. The true treasure is in your heart, in your willingness to trust and sacrifice. And in that, you have found the greatest gift of all, the love and grace of God. With the treasure secured and the knowledge of its true value, Eliab returned to his village, where he was greeted not as a man with riches, but as a man with wisdom. The story of his sacrifice and discovery spread quickly, and people began to see that the greatest treasures were not always those that could be held in the hands, but those that filled the heart. Eliab and Miriam worked together to rebuild their life, but it was no longer the same life. They had learned that true wealth comes from a heart at peace, and they shared their blessings with those around them, knowing that the treasure they had found was meant not just for them, but for all. And as Eliab sat on the porch of their new home, the evening sun setting once more, he realized that he had not only found treasure in the field, but a treasure that had been hidden in his own heart all along. As the weeks passed, Eliab's life slowly transformed. The village, once a place of quiet struggle, now felt different. His heart was lighter, his steps more certain. Though he had endured the sacrifice of selling everything he owned, he no longer felt the weight of that loss. In its place was a sense of profound peace, as if he had finally discovered the rhythm of a life he was meant to live. He worked in the fields, but now his work felt like a calling, not a burden. He no longer labored simply for survival, but with a sense of purpose. Every seed he planted, every furrow he tilled, was a step toward a future filled with hope, not just for his family but for others as well. One afternoon, as Eliab was walking back from the field, he noticed a group of villagers gathered near the well. There was a sense of unrest in the air. Eliab approached cautiously, his curiosity piqued. He overheard snippets of conversation, pieces of the puzzle that were troubling the people. There's a drought coming. The crops will fail. We'll have nothing to eat this winter. I heard the traders are charging more for grain. It's already too much to pay for what little we have. Eliab felt a pang of concern. He understood the hardship of the village, the fear that crept into the hearts of families when the future seemed uncertain. But as he stood there, something shifted within him. A thought that had been germinating ever since he had discovered the treasure in the field began to take root. His mind went back to the moment when Jesus had spoken to him, when he had revealed the true meaning of the treasure Eliab had found. The kingdom of heaven, Jesus had said, was hidden but would transform everything it touched. Perhaps this was the moment when Eliab could become an instrument of that transformation. He walked toward the villagers and called out to them. "Friends," he said, his voice steady but filled with a deep conviction, "I know the fears that weigh on your hearts. I have lived those fears. But I want to share with you what I have found." The villagers turned to him, intrigued. Eliab continued, "The treasure I have found is not just gold or jewels. It is the understanding that in our hearts, we have everything we need to overcome any difficulty. The kingdom of heaven is within us, and through it we can find strength even in the hardest times." He paused, looking at their faces marked by worry, by struggle. "I may not have enough to provide for everyone, but I will share what I can. And together we can face this challenge not with fear but with faith." There was silence for a moment as the villagers absorbed his words. Then slowly the tension in the air began to ease. One by one the people nodded. A quiet understanding began to grow among them. Eliab's words had sparked something deep within them, the realization that they could come together, support each other, and weather the coming storm. As the seasons changed and the drought came, the village's situation grew more dire. The crops had failed and food became scarce. Eliab watched as his neighbors grew anxious, their eyes hollow with worry. But instead of retreating into fear, he focused on the lessons he had learned. the lessons that Jesus had imparted to him. Eliab began to share what little he had. His family's stockpile of grain was small, but it was enough to help feed a few families. The small chest of gold he had found was used to buy grain from distant traders, ensuring that there was food for the village. As the days went by, more and more villagers came to him. Some sought his wisdom, others his generosity. Eliab had become not just a farmer, but a symbol of hope, a living testament to the power of faith and sacrifice. One day, a weary traveler arrived at the village. He was a stranger, dressed in simple robes, and he looked like he had been walking for days. He made his way to Eliab's small home, where Miriam was tending to the fire. "Are you the man who has been helping the villagers?" the traveler asked, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. Eliab, who had just returned from the fields, turned to face the stranger. "I try to help where I can. What brings you here?" "I have heard stories of your kindness," the traveler said, his eyes weary but kind. "I've been wandering for many days, seeking a place of rest and food. But there is little to be found." Eliab felt a deep compassion for the man. "You've come to the right place," he said. "Come sit by the fire. You'll find rest here." As the man settled by the hearth, Eliab saw that his clothes were torn, his feet blistered from the journey. He offered the traveler food and water, and the man gratefully accepted. As they ate, Eliab noticed that the traveler's eyes seemed to gleam with a quiet understanding. There was something familiar about him, something that resonated deeply within Eliab. The traveler looked at him with a soft smile. "I've traveled many places," he said, "and I've seen many men who hoard what they have, who fear losing what they possess. But you give freely. Why?" Eliab paused, considering the question. "Because I've learned that true wealth is not what we hold in our hands, but what we give to others. I found a treasure far greater than gold or silver, and it's that treasure that has made me who I am." The traveler's smile deepened. "And that treasure is?" he asked, his eyes twinkling with a knowing light. Eliab leaned forward, his voice quiet but full of conviction. "It is the kingdom of heaven. It is the love and grace of God that fills our hearts. It is the belief that we are meant to share our blessings, not hoard them." The traveler nodded, as if hearing these words had confirmed something he already knew. "You have found the true treasure, Eliab," he said softly. "And now you are sharing it with the world." Eliab stared at the man for a long moment, a sense of recognition stirring deep within him. It was as if he had met this person before, though he couldn't place where or when. But in his heart, he knew that the traveler was more than just a weary man seeking food. He was a messenger, a reminder of the treasure Eliab had found. The drought passed, but its effects lingered. Yet the village had changed. Eliab's words and actions had inspired a deep transformation within the people. They began to support one another in ways they never had before, sharing what little they had, working together to rebuild their lives. Eliab too had changed. The treasure he had found was no longer just a chest of gold. It was the realization that true wealth was not in what one possessed, but in how one loved, how one gave, and how one lived with integrity. One evening, as Eliab sat in his humble home, surrounded by his family and the people he had come to love as his own, he thought of the words Jesus had spoken to him long ago. "The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field. When a man finds it, he will sell all he has to buy that field." Eliab smiled to himself. He had given everything not just for the treasure in the field, but for the kingdom of heaven itself. A kingdom not of gold or riches but of love, grace, and compassion. And in that, he had found a wealth beyond measure. As the stars filled the night sky, Eliab knew that the legacy of the treasure would live on, not just in his heart, but in the hearts of all who had witnessed the power of faith, sacrifice, and the kingdom of heaven. And with that, Eliab closed his eyes, knowing that the greatest treasure of all was already within him. This is end of the story. Comment amen if you believe in Jesus' blessings. Please like this video and subscribe this channel for more Jesus story like this. May the God watch over you.